Hi, I'm Melissa, and welcome to our shift sleeve hack. You asked, and so we're doing it. We're going to show you today how to make a gathered shift sleeve. Since this particular video is a hack, it is not the entire shift sew along, so you will need to refer to the original shift sew along videos. And for any instructions related to the sleeve, refer to this video instead. So the first thing that we need to do for our shift sleeve hack is to take measurements, because they will be a little bit different than they were for our basic shift sleeve. So for this style of shift sleeve, we want a fuller sleeve. So when we take our measurements, we're going to take that into consideration. And we also want our sleeve to be just a little bit longer than the straight shift sleeve was. So to take your measurements for this, you want to go from your shoulder point down the back of your arm, around your bent elbow, to the widest part of your forearm, which will be about an inch or so below the crease of your elbow. So we'll take that measurement. This is easier if you have somebody to help you, but you can do it yourself. You can also do it with just a string if you don't want to number. So about there is, we're going to say it's about 18.5 inches, so we're going to cut it at 19, yes, 19 for seam allowances. And then you want to take a measurement around that fullest part of your forearm. This will be the length of our cuff. You don't necessarily need to add much in the way of seam allowance, but you also don't want to pull this super tight. Your sleeve buttons or ribbons that you use to keep your sleeves closed will give a little bit of give at this point. So that's 10.5. So for the width of your shift sleeve, instead of taking the bicep measurement like we did on the other sleeves, you want to take the measurement for the length of your cuff and at least double it, depending how fine your fabric is and how full you want your sleeves. So I'm going to make my sleeve at 21 inches. And the width of your cuff, these sleeve cuffs are historically very narrow. They run from about 3/8 of an inch to about 5/8 of an inch usually. I like them pretty fine, but for a little bit of ease of taping, we're going to make this one at a 1/2 inch wide finished. So that means when you cut it, you want to cut it so that it is 10.5 inches long, and then 1/2 is 1, and 1/4 inch on either end for your seam allowances is you'll cut it at 1.5 inches wide. So you have the measurements for your shift sleeve length and width, and you will also need gussets, and those can be the same size as the ones that were in the previous shift sleeve. So we'll take our fabric here. My piece of fabric is already about 19 inches long. So then I want to measure over the 21 inches for my sleeve width. I do prefer to pull a thread when I am trying to cut something on the straight of grain. It takes a little longer, but you will be much happier with that nice straight line. If you are like me and your sleeve ends up really square, you may want to put a little mark at some point on your sleeve to determine either the top or the bottom of the sleeve. Otherwise, it's going to end up a little squirrely looking. You can make your sleeves wider than what we're suggesting, but just remember, every bit of that fabric that is in your sleeve has to fit underneath whatever garment you're wearing as your main garment. So if you're wearing a jacket or a gown, that sleeve has to fit over all the fabric that is in your shift sleeve. That's why we suggest only doing it about 2 times your wrist measurement. After you have all your shift sleeve pieces cut out, the shift sleeve, the gusset, and the cuff, then you can sew them together. The only difference between the standard shift sleeve and the gathered cuffed shift sleeve is that you want to leave about a 2.5-inch vent at the bottom of your shift sleeve, just like you would do on a man's shirt. Hem that vent either by folding one seam allowance to the inside and one to the outside, which is how the fabric wants to roll when you're doing your felled seam, or you can fold both sides to the inside and hem them. You will need to make just a tiny little clip where you're trying to turn one of them in a direction it really doesn't want to go, and then throw a few extra stitches over that just to stabilize it. So you can set your sleeves aside for right now, and we will prepare the cuffs to get them ready to put onto the shift sleeve. First thing you want to do is to go ahead and fold under about a 1/4 inch all the way around, and go ahead and baste that once you get it all folded. So once you have it all basted, then you can fold it in half. That will be the finished width of your cuff. Give it a good finger press. So the next step is actually both decorative and functional. We're going to pull a thread about 3 or 4 threads away from your top fold. This fold is the outside of the cuff when you put it on the shift sleeve. So we want to pull a thread that is about 3 or 4 threads below that fold. And pulling threads on linen can be a little challenging at times, but just have patience. And if you need extra strength reading glasses or a magnifier to do this, don't be ashamed. It makes it so much easier. You also want to pull a thread about the same distance away from the bottom edge fold on your cuff. So we'll do that now. And if you want to do this step before you fold and baste, you can do that. That way you make sure that you get a nice straight fold line, because you can follow a thread that is just your 3 or 4 threads away from your pulled thread. But pulling the thread gives you a really nice line to follow when you're doing your teeny tiny top stitching, because that's what we will be doing next. That top stitching holds the fold in the bottom edge of your cuff, as well as holding the fold that will be in the top edge, and it just borders that cuff very nicely. You can, if you have a little bit wider cuff, do 2 rows, either at the top or the bottom or both, which looks very pretty as well. To do the top stitching, I like to just take a couple of stitches on the back of my work and anchor my threads rather than tying knots. Either way is perfectly acceptable. So when you're doing this top stitching, it is a back stitch, and you want to only catch about 2 threads in each of your stitches. So this is where you get to practice your super tiny perfect sewing. If you need to do this as a stabbing technique rather than all from the front of your work, you can do that. I also have a habit of sewing really, really tiny, so that's just how it works out for me. So now that you have your top stitching done on your band, we can prep the sleeve to attach to the band. To do that, we're going to run some tiny little gathering stitches. The smaller the stitches are, the tighter your gathers will be, and the more consistent and the easier they will be to actually put onto your cuff. I like to gather with a contrasting thread so I can actually see what I'm doing. It doesn't have to be like black or red or anything, because that can leave marks on your white fabric. So something just a little bit different colored than your fabric is good to use. If you want to be historically accurate, you can use the white thread. We know that in the 18th century they were using the white linen thread to do their gathers, because sometimes they're not taking it out of the fabric when they're finished. So if you want to do it that way and can see what you're doing, great. I can't really see what I'm doing if I don't use a contrasting thread, and it will make it easier for you to see what I'm doing. Since we're leaving about a 1/4 inch seam allowance, what I find is the best way to do this is to run a gathering stitch about 1/8 of an inch from the bottom edge of your sleeve, and then run a second parallel stitch trying to match up your stitches, which we'll see as soon as that's done, as closely as you can so you get very consistent gathers. And that way you can stitch between the 2 rows of gathering stitch when you attach your sleeve to your wristband, and it works a lot easier than having stitches that don't quite match up. So you want to run about 3 to 4 threads per stitch. You can count them if you want to. I prefer to just kind of work by eye or by feel. Once you've run a few million gathering stitches, you kind of get the idea of how big they need to be. Leave you a little tail so that you can pull up your stitches later to gather your sleeve into your wristband. So if you're in a serious gathering stitch mood, you can also do this same stitch along the top edges of your sleeve, because we will do the same to gather the top of the sleeves to attach them to the body of the shift. You do not want to run your gathering stitches along your sleeve gusset, because that, if we were to gather the sleeve gusset, it would just give you a lot of bulk under your arm, which is really uncomfortable and will chafe horribly. So don't gather the gussets. So now that we have the bottom edge of our sleeve gathered, or the gathering stitches run, we can attach the cuff to the sleeve. With the ends of your cuff, I have left them unfinished right now because I'm just going to whip them together from the outside. Another option is to turn the cuff wrong side out and have your seam allowances open and backstitch along that seam line and then turn it to the right side. Either way is perfectly acceptable. It just depends how you want to do it. If you are going to stitch it right sides together, I suggest you do that before you do the top stitching along the bottom folded edge of your cuff, because otherwise it makes it really challenging. So for attaching your cuff to your sleeve, the first thing to do is make match points. Is the easiest way to make sure that things get even. You can just give a hard press with your fingers to the middle of the length of your cuff, or you can put a pin there, and then for the quarter marks you just fold in half from the end to that center pin, and then you do the same thing on the opposite end of your cuff. And then you want to do the exact same thing with your sleeve. So we'll mark our center and our quarters, so that you can match the marks on your sleeve to the marks on your cuff. So now we can match the pins on our cuff to the pins on the sleeve. You want to do this so that the cuff is sitting on the outside of the sleeve. Pin those spots where you have created your match points. You want to set your cuff along what is going to be your stitching line, which I left about a 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I want the edge of the finished top edge of my cuff to sit at about a 1/4 inch in, which in theory should be directly between those two rows of gathering stitches. And I left the ends of my gathering stitches towards the inside of the sleeve just because that's how I prefer to do it. I think that it makes it a little easier to gather it up. You can, if you want to, break your thread halfway with your gathering stitches. So like go from the edge to the center and then the center to the other edge of your vent. I just think it makes it a little bit neater at that center point to use one length of thread for your gathering stitches. So once you have your points pinned, you can then gather up your fabric with your ends. Just easing it to fill the space between your pins. And so to keep the tension on your gathering threads while you're stitching, you can just wrap those ends of your gathering threads around the pin in a figure 8 a couple of times, and that will keep them in place and keep them a little bit more out of your way. And at this point, you can, if you want to, baste it. I am a pinner, so I will pin my cuff to my sleeve as I am evening out those little gathers between each set of pins in each 1/4 of my cuff and sleeve seam. They don't have to be super perfect right at this point, but if you want to really straighten them out while you're pinning, you can do that. I usually wait until I am stitching to do that part. So you can start to see how important it was to get those gathering stitches very tiny. And now we're ready to stitch our cuff to our sleeve. You want to anchor your thread with your chosen method, whatever is comfortable for you. I like to take a couple of little back stitches and anchor my well waxed linen thread. We're going to whip the cuff to the outside of the sleeve, just catching the top edge of each one of our little gathers to the top edge of our cuff. And you can use the tip of your needle to finesse them into place. Try to make them fairly even. You will find that when you pulled up your gathering stitches, some of them want to hide behind the other ones, so haul them out into the light. So after you're finished whipping your gathers to the front of your cuff. You want to go to the inside, and again, you can pin or baste it or just be lazy and hold it like I do. Anchor your thread, and you want to do the same thing on the back side that you did on the front side, and you want to catch the peak of each little gather again on the inside of your cuff, just like you did on the outside. Before we gather our shift sleeve onto the body of our shift, we want to, and you can see I've already done it here, you want to fold under the seam allowance that is going to go onto your sleeve. You do not need to fold under the seam allowance that will make up the side seam of your shift, because that will be sewn just like a normal shift is. After you've folded under your armscye seam on the body of your shift and basted that so that it's ready to go, you want to take the measure of your armscye, which is the seam that goes right around your armpit. You don't want to get it super tight up around your underarm. One, you may not be able to get your bicep through the hole, and two, it will be very uncomfortable. So you want to leave a little bit of space under your arm where the gusset seam will meet the side seams of your shift. So we'll take that measure, and you can either mark it with a pen or with a pencil mark. And then we're going to fold that tape or that measure in half. The halfway point will be the top of your shoulder. And then you want to subtract the gusset measure from where you have pinned and where the other end of your measure is. And you can mark that. So that ends up being where you want your sleeve gathers to start and end. So go ahead and transfer that marking over onto the body of your shift, on the front and on the back. And that is where you will gather your sleeve into. So you want to take your sleeve, and unlike the way the sleeve was set in the original Shift Sew Along video, where you had the right sides of your shift sleeve and your shift body together, what we're going to do is take the center point of the top of your shift sleeve, and just like we did when we put the band on, we're going to slide that underneath the folded edge of our shift body and line it up between our two rows of gathering stitches. And then you want to pin the seam where your shift sleeve attaches to your underarm gusset. You want to match that to the end point that we figured out earlier for the gathering stitches for our sleeve. And then we'll turn it over and do the same to the other side of the sleeve. Once you have those points pinned, I then personally like to find the centers between my shoulder and the bottom of my gathering area on the shift body as well as on the sleeve. So I'm going to do that right now. Just makes it a little bit easier for you to ease in that sleeve and have it end up even and neat. And then using those center points, match the sleeve up to the body. Do the same on the other side. And then you can gather up the top of that sleeve. To fit into the in between those marks on your arm's eye. And this is the point where you can decide if you want things to be gathered evenly across the distance of the top of your sleeve, or if you want more of your gathers at the top of the arm, which is not unusual to see on originals. You probably want the least amount of gathering under your arm because it will just create bulk if you put too much under there. If you get to a point where you're not happy with the amount of gathers that are in your sleeve, you can, of course, pull the pins out and adjust things a little bit just to make it a little more aesthetically pleasing, or shift where the largest amount of your gathers are sitting on your sleeve. And once you've gotten your gathered portion of your sleeve pinned in, then you can pin the gusset, lay the raw edge of your sleeve gusset along the raw edge that is turned under of your shift body. And you can leave about the last 1/4 inch or so of that gusset unpinned and then unstitched because that will be taken care of when you go back and do your seams on the body of your shift, as well as with the reinforcement that covers the raw edges on the inside of your shift. You may have noticed that our shift body and our shift sleeve are not the same color of linen. That is fine. They are also not the same quality of linen as we discussed earlier in this video. You really want your gathered shift sleeve to be a lighter weight linen so that it will not create a lot of bulk under your tighter sleeves of your gowns and jackets. So since they are different linens, They may not match perfectly, which is fine because you see that frequently in extant garments. And the only people who are going to see you in just your shift probably aren't going to care about the quality of the materials. Once you have your sleeve all pinned in, you can go ahead and baste it if you are a baster. I like to live dangerously and work around the pins, so that's how I'm going to do mine. For the part that is attaching to the gusset and that is not gathered, we're going to do a felling stitch. If you don't remember how to do a felling stitch, check out our quick stitch tutorial on felling stitches, and you can do that there. So I'm going to anchor my thread right at the corner of my gusset, and I just take a couple of back stitches in the same spot to anchor that thread. So now I'm going to do a felling stitch until I get to the gathers, and then I'll switch over to a whip stitch. So now that I've reached the gathered section of my sleeve, I did shift most of my gathers a little closer to the top of the sleeve. So I'm going to continue with my felling stitch for just a little bit longer. Now that I've gotten into the gathered area of my shift sleeve, I'm going to transition into a whip stitch. Just like the way we attach the band to our shift sleeve, we will just catch the peaks of our gathers as we whip the sleeve to the body of the shift. So once you've finished sewing your shift sleeve to your shift body, then you'll need to go ahead and finish your side seam the way you are instructed to do it in the initial shift sew along video. Then you can turn your shift wrong side out. And we're going to cover that seam just like we did in the original shift video. And if you remember, Christina explained that using the armhole reinforcement to cover your seam was an excellent option for when you are doing a gathered sleeve, because it's a lot easier to cover this seam, this raw edge, than it is to try to fold it under and fell it like we do all the other seams on the shift. One thing that you do need to remember when you are sewing your reinforcement to the gathered portion of your sleeve is just like we did when we did the sleeve band. You need to just hit the peaks of your gathers as you are stitching this portion of your reinforcement to the inside of your shift. So now that you have your shift all done, you have this lovely little sleeve with the sleeve band that you can use your nifty sleeve buttons, or you can use a ribbon or string to tie them. And so now you can make another shift that has a different style of sleeve. Thank you for joining us for this shift sleeve hack. We hope that if you've enjoyed this video, you will like, subscribe, and leave a comment down below. And make sure that you tag us with your makes. Happy stitching!